The room is dim. Only a few candles fight against the shadows, their wax dripping slowly onto a splintered table. The air is heavy with smoke from the hearth, and beneath it the sharper sting of iron heated too many times. Somewhere behind a wooden partition, a muffled scream claws its way through the silence, then another, louder, rawer. The door creaks, and a peasant is dragged forward, trembling, his face pale beneath layers of dirt. He's forced into a chair, his head gripped between the calloused hands of an assistant who shows no mercy, only the routine indifference of someone who has done this many times before. On the table beside him lies the tool of salvation, or damnation. Iron pliers, their surface blackened, their edges rust-bitten, waiting to tear rather than heal. There is no comfort offered, no anaesthetic, no sterile cloth, only a muttered prayer, whispered as though it might dull the agony to come. The man's eyes dart from the candlelight to the steel to the floor, already sticky with the blood of others. He knows what awaits. The entire village knows. The barber surgeon steps forward. His hands, stained with hair and blood alike, do not hesitate. He's not only the cutter of hair, but of flesh, the fixer of bones, the puller of teeth. His trade is necessity, not mercy. He tilts the peasant's chin upward, pries the jaw open, and positions the pliers around a rotten molar that has festered for months. The first tug is sudden. A crack echoes like a gunshot through the chamber. The man convulses, the tooth holds, the pliers twist, grinding against gum and bone. The assistant's grip tightens as the victim's legs thrash against the straw-littered floor. Blood floods the mouth. The scream becomes a guttural roar, half pain, half terror. And yet, this is not madness. It is medicine. This is what healing looked like for centuries. But this is only the beginning. If history's darkest truths fascinate you, subscribe, because what comes next will make you grateful for the dentist's chair you sit in today. The pliers wrench again. This time the tooth gives way, not cleanly, but jagged, leaving fragments buried deep. Blood pours freely now, mixing with saliva, dripping down the chin, staining the man's tunic. The surgeon spits into the straw, wipes his brow, and steps back as if the ordeal were nothing more than routine. The patient collapses forward, half conscious, but alive. Alive, though permanently marked by the ritual of pain. Such scenes were repeated endlessly across medieval Europe, in city streets, in smoky taverns, in market squares where gawking crowds jeered at the sight of another man's suffering. Barber surgeons carried their tools from village to village, as essential to survival as the miller or the blacksmith. For when toothache struck, when infection spread through the jaw and skull, there was no waiting, no gentle remedy. Only extraction, brutal, immediate, final. For the people of the Middle Ages, pain was currency, endurance was virtue, and submission to such horrors was not questioned, because there was no alternative. Behind every closed door, men and women sat trembling in that same wooden chair, clenching their fists, praying not for mercy, but for speed. The practice was institutionalized, accepted, even celebrated as necessity. In a world where decay meant death, the surgeon's iron grip was the only shield against festering infection. And yet, each extraction carried its own risk of blood loss, shock, or the invisible spectre of sepsis that would strike days later, unseen but merciless. The chamber of pain was not merely a workshop, it was a threshold, a place where the line between healing and mutilation blurred so completely that few dared to question it. Outside, the screams fade into the night. Then, slowly, another sound emerges, the tolling of distant church bells. Their echoes carry across the rooftops, reminding all who hear them that suffering was not only tolerated but sanctified. For in the medieval world, medicine was chained to faith, and soon the rituals of the church would become as entwined with the agony of teeth as the surgeon's iron itself. The church bells that tolled above the chamber of pain were not only a call to prayer, they were a reminder that in the Middle Ages faith and medicine were bound together in one suffocating embrace. For toothache was not merely seen as decay, but as infestation, a living thing burrowing through bone, the toothworm. Across Europe, whispers spread of this unseen parasite, tiny coiling creatures gnawing from within, their hunger carving cavities in human flesh. To the medieval mind, the explanation was perfect. Pain was not abstract. It had a face, a worm writhing in the darkness of the mouth, and so the cure was not to heal, but to drive the invader out. In cathedrals and small parish churches alike, priests stood over the suffering with censers of smoking incense. Patients knelt trembling, jaws clenched, while holy words rang out over them. Exorcisms, prayers, invocations meant to banish the unseen. The smoke was believed to suffocate the toothworm, forcing it to flee. Mothers held their children tight as wisps of frankincense and myrrh coiled into mouths, stinging eyes, choking throats. Some swore they felt the worm wriggle free in the haze, though no eyes ever truly saw it. And when the prayers failed, when the agony returned sharper than before, fear turned desperate. Faith twisted into torture. Barber surgeons, impatient with the church's invisibilities, brought fire and iron. They heated chisels in open flames until they glowed red, then pressed them against swollen gums, believing the heat would burn the worm alive. Others hammered small wedges between teeth, splintering bone, certain that if the creature were trapped it could be smoked out with sulphur and vinegar poured into the wound. The pain was unbearable. The smell of scorched flesh lingered for days. And yet, people submitted willingly, for to them the enemy was not the surgeon's hand, but the worm that devoured from within. Better to endure fire than to be eaten alive. Children were not spared. In fact, their youth was seen as purity, perfect vessels for faith's experiments. Tiny mouths forced open, priests whispering Latin spells as hot fumes filled their lungs. Mothers looked on in anguish, torn between two evils, the brutal certainty of iron pliers or the sanctified smoke of the church. Some chose prayer, others chose steel. Many watched their children suffer both. The terror was compounded by promises of miracles. Relics of saints, splinters of bone, fragments of cloth were paraded through towns, each said to cure toothache with a touch. Pilgrims travelled for miles to press their swollen jaws against the reliquaries, hoping for relief. For a coin slipped to the priest, a blessing was offered. For a larger offering, a relic was allowed to brush the gums themselves, and so faith became a marketplace, a thriving trade in fragments of bone and shards of wood, each more dubious than the last. Some merchants even carved pig teeth, dipped them in wax, and sold them as holy charms against the toothworm. Pain made believers of everyone. Fraud thrived where agony was currency, but belief alone could not stop the rot. And when faith failed, iron and fire stepped in. The faith that promised miracles often dissolved into silence, leaving the afflicted once more in the surgeon's chair. And here, salvation came not from relics or incense, but from iron. Spread across a wooden table were the tools of agony, instruments forged not with precision, but with violence in mind. The simplest was the forceps, iron jaws that clamped down upon rotten teeth with a grip so crude they crushed as often as they removed. A twist, a pull, a snap of bone louder than the patient's scream. Then there was the pelican, a curved lever shaped like the beak of a bird. It was wedged between gum and tooth, then driven forward with brute force, prying the molar from its socket. The pressure often shattered more than it saved, tearing away fragments of jaw. Patients stumbled from the chair with mouths ruined forever, bleeding, half their face collapsed inward. And for the unlucky, there was the tooth key. Resembling the tool of a locksmith, it was placed atop the tooth, then twisted sharply as though unlocking a door. The tooth rarely came out whole. Roots splintered, gums ripped, bone cracked beneath the torque. The surgeon wiped his hands, the crowd applauded, and another life was marked with permanent mutilation. Yes, the crowd. For these horrors were not always hidden behind walls. They were staged in public squares, under the open sky, where barber surgeons set up their chairs like performers at a fair. They dressed in bright colours, called out with theatrical flair, promising quick relief and certain cure. People gathered in circles, children perched on shoulders, coins exchanged hands, and then, before their eyes, a victim was strapped in place. The pelican gleamed, the tooth key turned, and the crowd erupted in cheers or laughter at the sight of agony. Screams mingled with the calls of merchants, the barks of dogs, the songs of musicians. Pain became entertainment. The suffering of others was part of the festival. Over time, these cries became background noise. The shriek of torn flesh was no longer shocking, but expected. As ordinary as the ringing of church bells, as familiar as the toll of the market bell. Children grew up with the sound, mothers hardened themselves to it, fathers accepted it as proof of resilience. To suffer publicly was to be human, but archaeology does not forget. Centuries later, when graves were opened, the skulls told their silent testimony. Splintered jaws, crushed sockets, roots left embedded to fester. Infections carved pathways into bone, revealing the scars of untreated agony. Some skulls bore holes where abscesses had eaten through the jaw into the skull itself. Others carried the marks of repeated failed attempts. 3, 4, even 5 broken roots still lodged in the gum line. Each attempt a failure, each one another layer of torment. These were not isolated mistakes. They were systemic, routine, accepted as the price of living long enough to suffer from decay, and for many, the ordeal did not end with the extraction. It only began. A shattered jaw could lead to infections spreading silently through the blood, an abscess rupturing into the brain, a fever rising that no priest, no relic, no surgeon could quell. It was this hidden epidemic, the slow poison of dental infection, that claimed lives in silence. A plague less visible than the Black Death, but no less cruel. And it was spreading, unchecked, beneath the laughter of the crowds and the applause of the fairground. The skulls exhumed from medieval graves whisper of something far darker than shattered teeth. They speak of what happened after, of the infection that took root, spread unseen, and consumed its victims from within. A single abscess, left untreated, could become a death sentence. The poison seeped into the blood, swelling gums into grotesque tumours, choking throats, and sending fever raging through the body. Sepsis, though the word did not exist, was merciless. Some lingered for weeks in delirium, others died overnight, their faces twisted, jaws locked shut by agony. Imagine the knight, his duty to wear armour, to bear the weight of steel upon his head. But his jaw has swollen grotesquely, pushing against the strap of his helmet, making it impossible to close. He paces in his tent before battle, sword at his side, but defeated not by an enemy's blade, only by a rotten tooth. Or the monk, hunched over parchment in the cloister, scratching words into the margins of a holy manuscript. Not prayers, not scripture, but desperate pleas. God, take this pain from my jaw. God, grant me sleep. His handwriting trembles, the ink blots uneven, his devotion crumbling under the endless throb of infection. No one escaped. The rich who dined on sweetened wines, the poor who gnawed stale bread until their teeth cracked, kings in castles, peasants in huts, each felt the same sharp terror of a tooth turned rotten. History remembers their crowns and victories, but rarely the abscess that swelled beneath their lips. Yet the records remain. In 1066, King Harold II, remembered for his death at Hastings, was said to suffer unbearable toothache that plagued him before battle. In France, Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had so many abscesses and extractions that entire meals had to be pulped into liquid for him to swallow. His reign, grand, glittering, absolute, was shaped by a mouth that betrayed him. The political consequences of teeth were real. A monarch unable to speak from pain could not lead councils. A ruler too fevered from infection could not stand before armies. Kingdoms trembled because of wounds no larger than a fingernail. And yet, this epidemic left no great chronicles, no dramatic plagues carved into memory. It was a quieter terror, a hidden killer that claimed its victims behind closed doors. Families buried their dead and blamed God, never the tooth that poisoned them. That silence made it all the more dangerous, because it was everywhere, in every village, every monastery, every court, an invisible plague that democracy, nobility and divinity could not escape. But while many suffered in silence, others turned their agony into spectacle, turning human suffering into a carnival. The silence of the cloister, the hidden deaths in royal chambers, these were tragedies unseen. But in the marketplace, suffering became performance. Here the tooth puller was not a humble tradesman, he was a showman, a jester of agony. Dressed in flamboyant colours, with feathers in his cap and a cloak bright enough to catch the eye from across the square, he strutted through the crowd like an actor upon a stage. His voice boomed above the din of merchants and animals, promising relief, promising miracles. Step forward, good people. One tug, and your pain is gone forever. And people did step forward, the desperate, the curious, the unlucky. They climbed onto his makeshift platform, sat upon the rickety chair, and opened their mouths to fate. But the performance was not always what it seemed, for among the patients were accomplices, assistants pretending to be plagued with agony. They writhed, they moaned, they clutched their cheeks in false torment, until the tooth puller seized them, yanked with theatrical flourish, and held aloft a bloody tooth for all to see. The accomplice staggered up, suddenly healed, grinning through crimson lips. The crowd gasped, then applauded. If the worm could be conquered in him, it could be conquered in anyone. Coins rained into the puller's purse. Business was secured. The true patients fared differently. The forceps bit deep. The pelican cracked bone. The tooth key twisted until jaws fractured under the strain. Blood sprayed across the straw. Some stumbled away screaming, faces swollen beyond recognition. Others never walked away at all. Death came quietly sometimes from shock or blood loss, leaving their bodies to be dragged from the stage while the next customer stepped forward. And yet the spectacle continued. The pulled teeth themselves became trophies, displayed on strings like rosaries or piled in jars for all to admire. Some tooth pullers sold them, claiming the discarded ivory carried luck, that keeping a stranger's molar in your pocket might guard you against pain. Bottles of bloodied teeth passed through the marketplace like charms, traded for bread or ale. The agony of one man became the talisman of another. Children clapped, women whispered prayers, men laughed through their unease. Slowly, the line between healer and entertainer dissolved until the screams were part of the music of the fairground. And why not? Pain was profitable. Suffering was currency. The louder the cries, the higher the applause, the heavier the purse. Medieval dentistry thrived not because it cured, but because it entertained. Not because it healed, but because it sold the illusion of healing. And as the crowds dispersed and the tooth puller packed away his bloodied tools, another promise lingered in the air. A new breed of practitioner was rising, one who spoke not of fairground miracles but of refinement, sophistication, even science. But behind their polished words, darker practices still waited in the shadows. The fairground tooth pullers faded into memory, but the pain did not. In the Renaissance, a new promise emerged: refinement, science, progress. Yet beneath the polished language and gilded instruments, the same cruelty lingered. Mercury, arsenic, and lead, poisons in our eyes today, were poured into mouths as remedies. The metals burned and blistered gums, seared tongues, and poisoned blood. Patients staggered from the chair dazed, their pain numbed only because their bodies were being poisoned from within. Rotten teeth were not always pulled, but bound. Surgeons threaded gold wire around them, twisting precious metal through inflamed gums in the hope of holding decay in place. Infections spread beneath the glittering bands, hidden but relentless, until jaws festered and faces collapsed. And then came the prosthetics, the first false teeth. To the nobles who could afford them, they were a symbol of wealth and status. But their beauty concealed horror, for many were carved not from ivory, not from bone, but from the mouths of the dead, executed criminals, fallen soldiers left to rot on battlefields, their teeth pried from lifeless jaws, polished and sold to the highest bidder. Imagine the banquet table, the duke, the lady, the king himself smiling broadly, their mouths filled with the teeth of strangers, the dead, quite literally, living inside the mouths of the living. It was elegance built upon desecration, vanity fueled by grave robbery, progress that left the taste of death in every word spoken, and yet these practices flourished. Because in the Renaissance, appearance mattered more than health. To smile with a full set of teeth, even if they belonged to someone else, was worth the poison, the infection, the constant risk of decay. This was the so-called Age of Enlightenment. But in truth, it was simply another chapter of pain. The tools were sharper, the metals brighter, the words more scientific. Yet the suffering remained, and as the Renaissance dawned, dentistry began its slow march toward modernity, a march that promised healing, yet carried with it shadows from the past. Because while the tools would change and the science would advance, the question remained the same. What truly separates the horrors of the Middle Ages from the practices we call modern today? Centuries have passed since the pelican and the tooth key, since priests smoked out imaginary worms, since nobles smiled with the teeth of the dead. And yet, the fear remains. The sterile chair of the modern dentist may gleam with white light and polished steel, but for many the sound of a drill still summons ancient terror. A memory buried deep in our collective past, the echo of screams in a market square, the crack of bone beneath iron. Dentistry has become science, it has become healing, but its roots lie in spectacle, in superstition, in suffering so profound it scarred generations. Every step forward was bought with centuries of agony. Every gleaming tool today is haunted by its crude ancestor. The story of medieval dentistry reminds us that medicine and cruelty have often walked hand in hand. that progress demands sacrifice, and too often the sacrifice is flesh. And so when you sit in the dentist's chair, when your heart races though you know you are safe, remember, the fear you feel is not weakness. It is history whispering through your blood. If this journey into history's darkest chambers has left you uneasy, subscribe, because the past still has darker secrets waiting to be unearthed.